you all this morning? Did everybody have a Merry Christmas? All right, awesome. Today we're going to lead off in our message, and we are still in this series where we're talking about Christmas songs. And today's song would have been lost if not for a couple of brothers. Their names were John and Frederick Work, and they traveled throughout Appalachia in the late 1800s. And what they were doing is they were searching for songs that they could include in a songbook that they were putting together. And so they were actually looking for spirituals that were sung by African American slaves. And the Work brothers didn't write this song. They didn't write "Go Tell It on the Mountain." We don't know actually who originally put that tune together with those words, but it was first published in 1807. And the refrain goes like this: "Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain, that Jesus Christ is born." Let's try singing that together. You ready? Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain, that Jesus Christ is born. And so when you look at a songbook and you look at the verses of that song, you notice that it's actually telling us a story, isn't it? It's telling us a story of the shepherds. Verse 1 tells of them out in the field, and there's a light in the sky. Verse 2, that light transforms into a choir of angels. Verse 3, the shepherds decide that they're going to go to Bethlehem to see the baby Jesus. And then verse 4 is them at the manger, and they're witnessing the coming of God's salvation. And in between those verses is that refrain. Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain, that Jesus Christ is born. So why would they do that when they were coming up with that song? Why would they do that? Why would they tell a story of shepherds seeing the baby Jesus and then join it with this refrain that talks about going and telling it on the mountain? Why would they do that? Because that's what the shepherds did, right? Now, we don't see a literal mountain involved, but what did they do when they saw Jesus, when they heard about Messiah coming? What did they do? Yeah, and that's what we see there in Luke chapter 2, verses 17 through 18. It says this: "When they had seen him, they spread the word concerning what had been told them about this child. And all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds said to them." These shepherds were the first people to take the good news of Jesus to someone else. Right? Now we read throughout the Gospels, and when you read through all the Gospels, you read through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you get a lot of the other details. You get, of the good news. It's filled out by the story and the life of Jesus and his ministry. We see him giving his life for us. We see him giving himself as a ransom to deliver us from our slavery to sin. But he did more than that, right? He defeated death. And in doing that, he opened up a way for us to transcend this flesh and be remade into his likeness. While we have been left here and we're a part of this world, one day Jesus will return and Jesus will judge the living and the dead. And the dead in Christ will rise, and we who are still alive will be changed in the twinkling of an eye. And from that day on, the throne of God will be with mankind, and we will dwell in the holy city of God. Right? Any of y'all already know that information? That's amazing information, isn't it? That's why that information, the stuff I just talked about, that information is called the gospel. Gospel means good news. Now, the shepherds didn't have all of the details, did they? The shepherds didn't have all the details. They didn't have the details about the death, burial, and resurrection. They didn't know that there would be this long period of history where the followers of Jesus would be left here to build the kingdom. All the shepherds knew was that what the Jewish people had been waiting for, what they prayed for, what they looked to the Scriptures for clues of, had been delivered. Right? In the big picture, think about how, you probably did this during this Christmas season, right? But think in the big picture how insignificant that package you were waiting for is. Anybody wait for a package this year? Right? Like you ordered it on Amazon. FedEx had it. You kept watching the tracking app on your phone. When's it going to be delivered, right? When's it supposed to? Oh, it's going to be today? Oh, it got delayed. Oh, it's going to be today? And then you get all stressed out over that. And then what happens when you get the notification that it's been delivered? You race out to your front door. The Christmas present that you ordered for your child is there. You say to your spouse, honey, I have good news. That toy has been delivered. Anybody ever been through this process? So you can pound all of that anticipation and you multiply it by about 1 million. Because Jesus isn't just some present. He's not just something we ordered that will make our kids happy for a few days. Jesus is the cure for our disease. Jesus is the solution to this impossible situation we've gotten ourselves into. Without Jesus, we are a mess. All of your frustration, all of your depression, all of your helplessness, the hole that you've dug yourself into, your feelings of inadequacy that you wrestle with every day, guess what? God has done something about that. The first thing I want us to think of today, I'm going to ask you a question. What is your relationship to the gospel? What is your relationship to the good news? Do you know the good news? Anybody know the good news? Amen. Do you realize that you were alienated from God? Do you know that the entire reason Jesus came was to buy people back for God? That's what it says in Revelation 5:9. It says there, and they sang a new song saying, you are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals because you were slain. And with your blood, you purchased for God persons from every tribe, language, and people and nation. And you have made them to be a kingdom and priests to serve our God, and they will reign on the earth. See, the good news is that God is giving you freedom. It's about Jesus offering you a new identity as a son of God. See, we think our problems are way too complicated, right? We think things are way too complex to simply say, Jesus is the answer. But you know what the good news is? Jesus is the answer. Do you know that? And then is that a conviction of yours? In other words, is it something that is life-defining? Is that information something that is life-changing? Because if you learn anything from studying through the Gospels, if you learn anything from reading about the life and ministry of Jesus, if you listen to what he says in the Gospels, guess what? This is an all-or-nothing proposition. So what is your relationship to the gospel? Another question I have for us today is, what are you doing with the gospel? I mean, yeah, there are those of us who have accepted it. We believe the good news. We claim to be recipients of it. We reap the benefits of it. But what are you doing with it? Anyone here today know what we are supposed to be doing with the good news? Anybody know what we're supposed to be doing with it?
How do you get
See, you're supposed to be doing with the good news what you do with everything you consider good news. What do you do with things you consider to be good news? Hey, did you hear that? Did you hear it? Hey, that movie is finally out. Man, that's supposed to be awesome. Have you seen it yet? Hey, did you hear? Our favorite team, they won last night. Right? Did you hear my cousin? My cousin made a complete recovery. See, we share information with people. If we know something that we think is good news, if we know something that we think someone else could benefit from, what do we do? What do you already do? You already share it, don't you? You share good news. We already share good news. The question is, are we sharing the good news about Jesus? See, this is what the shepherds did. They saw Jesus and they could not help but tell people. The chorus of the song comes from something that was said by the prophet Isaiah. It's Isaiah 40, verse 9. And here's what Isaiah says. You who bring good news to Zion, go up on the high mountain. You who bring good news to Jerusalem, lift up your voice and shout it. Lift it up. Do not be afraid. Say to the towns of Judah, here is your God. Do you get the imagery there? It's like saying, this is something you need to shout from the rooftops. Isaiah says, you got something you believe? You got good news? You should not be ashamed of it. If you really believe that it's good news, shout it out. Go stand on high ground. Proclaim it so that others can hear it. Christian, is it good news? Because good news has an impact. Good news brings joy. Good news changes lives. And if Jesus has not changed your life, maybe you don't see it as good news. Maybe it isn't good news because maybe to you it's bad news. Maybe it's bad news because your heart hasn't changed. Maybe you see Jesus as bad news because you don't want to submit to following Him. Maybe you want a Jesus who lets you do whatever you want, but is still obligated to let you into His heaven. Right? Anybody think that's true? You want a Jesus who lets you do whatever you want to do, but somehow He's obligated to let you into His heaven. Maybe you're all about Jesus doing His part in this agreement, but you refuse to acknowledge that He actually has expectations for you. I think about that, and I think of a guy that we meet when you read through the book of Acts. There's a guy in the book of Acts. He believed in God before he became a Christian. He was a very religious man before he became a Christian. And then one day, he was knocked to the ground by Jesus. Jesus knocked him off his horse. Right? And it was then that he became convicted that the things that these Christians were talking about, the things that these Christians were saying about Jesus, that those things were actually true. And that guy hit the ground as Saul the Pharisee, but a few days later, he raised from the waters of baptism the Apostle Paul. And Paul writes in his letter to the church at Rome, this is what he declares. He says this, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. First for the Jew, then for the Gentile. What does Paul say there? I'm not ashamed of the good news of Jesus Christ. See, he believes in the good news. He believes that it's life-changing. He believes it's the power of God for the salvation of everyone. Paul describes why not to be ashamed of the gospel, because the gospel is powerful.
Amen.
Right? Paul saw what the gospel could do. I'll tell you this, over my many years of ministry, I've seen it as well.
He's right.
What is it that can turn a guy who is angry and mean into a godly husband and a good father? What is it? It's the good news of Jesus Christ. I've seen it happen. What is it that can turn a woman who is insecure into a matriarch of her entire family? I've seen it happen. It's the good news of Jesus Christ. And brothers and sisters, it's not that the gospel can change lives. The gospel has changed lives. It is already proven. We've been given this amazing message to tell people. Are we going to be willing to proclaim it from the mountaintops? I think it's interesting that the command that Jesus gives to his disciples at the end of Matthew's gospel, he gives it to them while they're standing on a mountaintop. Isn't that kind of cool? And if you remember, Jesus told his disciples to meet him there. He said, "Hey, meet me on the top of that mountain in Galilee." And then they stood there. And while the disciples stood there, they could look out and they could see for miles and miles and miles. And in their minds, I bet they could imagine all of the people of the world. They could see all of the people in those little towns that they knew and they grew up in. But man, off past the horizon, I bet they imagined all of those people. And this is the scene where Jesus comes to them and he says this, "Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." Christian, let me ask you this. Do you realize that the responsibility of that command has been passed on to us? This is Jesus' way of making sure that the gospel is taken to each generation until he returns, right? How did it get to you? Somebody carried it. Somebody was a bearer of good news. So today what we're going to do is we're going to sing a song of invitation. If you're here this morning and you're a Christian, I challenge you to remember the things that have been invested in us, the message that's been invested in us. Is it good news to you? Are you more concerned about whether your team won or the new Star Wars movie that's out, or what's good news to you? Or is this message of Jesus? Hey, I got something to tell you about it. Hey, here's something that changed my life. Not, I go to church, you should come to church with me. Hey, here's something I believe. Here's a conviction that I have. Here's something that's life-changing and defining for me. Jesus came so that I can be brought back to God, and he can do it for you too. Is that good news?
Hallelujah.
If you want to make that decision today, you come forward as we all stand up and as we sing.